Hello, and welcome to this next in our series on repositioning for growth. It's nice to have you all here today. Please be aware that this session is being recorded, and you are able to ask us questions in the chat as we go through. Before we start with today's event, I would like to talk to you about some upcoming events that may be of interest. On the 14th of April, our L&D team are running a session on how to kickstart your career. And on the 22nd of April, we are having the next in our Occupier Insights series. April will also give us a Young Leaders Networking event, so be on the lookout for that. And in May, we will be running a follow-up session to the very successful Thrive, Not Just Survive session that we ran earlier in the year. And we will also be having a Young Leaders Summer Charity event as well. We've also announcing that our Q2 theme will be driving positive change. So there will be lots of good events coming through on that. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our annual sponsors, IWG, Savills and TOG, for their support. Without them, we would not be able to continue delivering all this great content. And now I would like to welcome and say a big thank you to Matt Pullen, Executive Vice President and Managing Director Europe of CyrusOne. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Vanessa. Oh, nice to see you.
Thank you for agreeing to join us today, Matt. I guess the best place to start, as we are talking about repositioning for growth this quarter, is to start with a little bit about CyrusOne, what they do, and your role within that.
Sure, no problem. So, hello to everybody. CyrusOne's the third largest US publicly quoted data center REIT, real estate investment trust. CyrusOne went public in around 2011 and has been predominantly focused on the US until 2018, when they came into Europe with the acquisition of a company called Zenium, which I was part of. It was a private equity backed business. Effectively, CyrusOne builds and operates data centers across the US and Europe, with the European portfolio being the high growth area at the moment. And currently, in terms of and using data center metrics in terms of capacity, we're pushing on for 200 megawatts of IT capacity across the major markets in Europe in around a dozen facilities, and growing, of course. And in terms of my role, end to end, in terms of the management of the European business, and I'm part of the senior management group of the global company.
Excellent, thank you. And as we look at repositioning for growth, data centers is an area that we think has kind of come through the global pandemic quite strongly, shall we say, and has probably benefited from the increased data capacity requirements of all these Zoom calls that we're now doing and all the video conferencing. What have you seen throughout the COVID-19 in the data center sector?
Well, I think the easiest metric to point to is that in 2020, the market that we operate in, which I should have explained is the co-location market, saw a 50% growth in headline signings relative to 2019. And that effectively means that over the last 5 years, the industry has been growing on average at 15% per year. But, last year was just incredible in terms of growth. Now, was that all about online platforms such as the one that we're on? Not necessarily. The growth was coming through, before the pandemic, and has really been fueled by the growth in the enterprise cloud market as well as the consumer cloud market. I think what the pandemic's done, but we can talk about it more, is that it's seen how the digital economy can sort of transcend some of the traditional barriers to outsourcing. And, we've seen significant growth in the enterprise cloud and consumer cloud markets in countries that generally you associate with slow rates of growth due to barriers to outsourcing. So it's been it's been a very interesting time, the last 12, 15 months, not just because of the pandemic, because of the march on of the digital economy.
Okay, and 50% growth sounds great, but in terms of delivering 50% growth in a pandemic and in lockdowns, I'm sure that presented some challenges.
Yeah, a lot of challenges. To say the last 12 months have been a blur, to be honest. It's not as if there was a great deal of capacity just lying around for the hyperscalers to install their platforms into. So a lot of the growth has had to have been delivered through ground up developments. So a couple of challenges during the pandemic. How do you keep a data center that's operational, fully manned and working 24/7? And how do you build new facilities, bearing in mind that the components that go to making up a data center, whilst they're not overly complicated, they need to be sourced from all around the world, and you need an awful lot of people involved in building the facilities. And with the issues during the pandemic of ensuring that people are kept safe, it meant that construction was challenging. So, in a nutshell.
And how have you responded to that need to keep your employees safe?
So from an operational point of view, it was relatively straightforward because data centers are they're highly secure environments with multiple layers of particularly access security. So introducing measures to do temperature checks, to do questionnaires, just to make sure anybody arriving on site didn't pose a risk to the operational staff within, was relatively straightforward. So not huge issues there. Construction was just a lot more difficult. As I mentioned, the volumes of people and the impossibility really of adhering to all the social distancing needs at all times. And again, we introduced every measure that you can imagine. We were supported in something we should talk about by governments in most of the European countries in the fact that we were allowed to stay open, but we stayed open with very strict measures to keep those people safe. And
obviously data centers don't build themselves. I'm sure that you have not been able to benefit in the same way that I have from being able to be sat at home nice and safe. How does that impact you personally, and maybe the mental health aspect of you and your people?
Yeah, it's a really good point because as I mentioned, data center can't run itself. People have to turn up to operate the data centers, and people have to turn up to build them. I think it was viewed naturally as a bit of an adventure at the beginning of the pandemic. And we made sure that we really tried to keep people buoyed. We rewarded our operations folk and our construction folk well. We were very conscious of ensuring that if people started to struggle, particularly because their families became nervous about them leaving the house every day, attending site and returning, that we were very flexible in terms of our approach to how they wanted to work to keep the relationships at home going. Very flexible around travel, making sure that people only travelled if they really felt comfortable to travel. During the last lockdown, what's been interesting, and again due to the very strong reaction from our government and from other European governments, even simple things like on the Slough trading estate, which people probably know is one of the prime data center locations in London, just seeing immediate testing centers set up to enable our people to get tested, on their way to work, on their way home from work, to just be happy. I think one of the challenges has been that the growth demands from the customers has been such that people have been just put under a lot of pressure from a work point of view to just to get things done. And if you combine that with nervousness around the virus, that just leads to fatigue, quite frankly. And then that fatigue is made worse when, for example, if you have a positive case on site and you need to lock down the site, and people might have to stay for longer periods of time and actually sleep on site, that adds to the fatigue. And also, the most interesting thing in the last phase of the pandemic has been that the travel restrictions and quarantine restrictions in country have got much, much, much tougher. So it means that anybody traveling from head office has to stay for a much longer period of time in country to make their trip worthwhile, because it may be they have to go into, say, Germany, and that they have to self-isolate irrespective of our critical status for, say, 5 days before they can then get on with their work. So I think fatigue is the headline there in the last phase of this pandemic, which I hope is the last phase.
Yes, we all hope it's the last phase. And there is more positivity now. We're all kind of hoping for a return to normality of some sort. So now that we're coming out of that pandemic phase, what are the trends that you're starting to see within data centers? Or the data center sector?
The trend is consistent, which is growth. I think to your point about, was growth fueled by the pandemic? Yes, it was, but what it's done is created momentum, because Cornet will be talking about what's the future of the office. And it's not just the fact that people will be working in a very different way and will be supported by technology, which fuels growth in data center demand, but it's also the thing I mentioned before around the view will largely be that enterprise companies will want to accelerate the outsourcing of their data center platforms. So if something like this happens again, that they're not constrained by an inability to access data centers in offices, or indeed be putting their people at risk when they can outsource to a group that's already got the systems and processes and measures in place to mitigate risk. So we're just going to see continued growth. Within I could bore everybody in terms of what are the dynamics going on within the industry, but the big issue is that demand is now concentrated into a very few hyperscale companies, and what is their outlook? Are they going to start to look at a mix of, as they have in the US, a mix of self-build versus colo? When we talk about data centers in 3 or 4 years' time, how will we define the market? Will it be a combination of what the colo providers do together with the self-build or hybrids that the hyperscalers build and in some cases operate themselves? So there's going to be some interesting dynamics coming through in the market. And then, of course, there's all the issues that come with extremely rapid growth in terms of its sustainability. I'll talk about sustainability under a different context, but in this case, is there enough power? Is it going to be easy enough and quick enough to get permits to keep feeding the growth? Is there going to be enough land within, very, very constrained locations that support the data center growth? All these issues are starting to come through, particularly in Europe's major markets.
Yeah, okay. And so talking about longevity, and you mentioned their sustainability as well, that's something that is a huge focus for all of the companies I work with at the moment. How is that manifesting in the data center world? And given that data centers, you have to kind of look a long time ahead of what the future demands are going to be, how are you doing that?
Vanessa, it's a really interesting point. I think, data centers have a poor perception. They're viewed as sort of big, ugly, dirty boxes, and which isn't necessarily fair, but perception is often reality. the first thing that we're doing is trying to educate government as to what data centers really are and where they need to be, importantly, because data centers need to follow GDP. They need to be in urban and suburban areas in major markets. Governments would like to think that they can just be anywhere, and indeed they can be anywhere where green energy is readily available. So in Europe, they should be in the Nordics for hydro, in the Baltics for wind, and in Southern Europe for solar, but it just doesn't work like that. So we're working hard to educate governments as to what data centers are and where they need to be. You may have seen in the press recently that 25 organisations, including ourselves, have come together to sign a climate neutral pact. That group also involves the big hyperscalers, with the objective of lobbying Brussels so that we are self-regulated. So we set our goals for sustainability and drive towards those goals. So things like green energy, ensuring that we're all procuring green energy, things like moving to hydrogen-based energy, even a hydrogen grid, things like lowering the PUE, sorry, that's a data center term, power utilization efficiency within these data centers to really improve efficiency, reducing the amount of water that we use, which is sometimes in conflict with that PUE aim, and just generally using less heat to cool, which sounds perverse, but data centers, they do two things. They provide an awful lot of power to drive servers and an awful lot of cooling to ensure that the heat generated by those servers doesn't lead to server failure. So how do we provide a lot of cooling without using a lot of that electricity to drive that cooling are things that we're looking at. We ourselves as a company have set our objective to be carbon neutral by 2040. And when you look at us in Europe, you'd think that was an easy target because we've got a brand new portfolio. In the US, we have a portfolio that was developed over the last 15, 20 years, and it's not quite as easy. So a lot of our focus on achieving sustainability targets is about repurposing legacy data centers with more efficient mechanical and electrical infrastructure.
Okay, so in terms of the older ones then, what can you actually do to bring them up to a sustainability standards? Is it a case of building new ones, or can you upgrade them somehow?
Cool. Yeah, I mean, when you think about a data center, it's all of the infrastructure that serves it. It's not complicated. It's just big. So you can swap out the air conditioning. Sorry, that's a sort of simple comment, but you can move from legacy cooling systems to modern adiabatic systems, for example. You can do a lot of things that dramatically reduce PUE. I think one of the other things to point out is that we're working hand in glove with the customers, and those customers are some of the biggest companies on the planet who are putting themselves through really stringent goals in terms of sustainability. So in many ways, what you're doing is you're working together and it just makes things happen that much faster. A lot of the inefficient data centers, to be honest, were built during the enterprise data center market phase, post 9/11. And that phase was driven largely by the investment banks who really wanted engineering excellence and resilience excellence. But what came with that was a lot of complexity and inefficiency. Now those platforms are being outsourced to the cloud. It is the hyperscalers who are driving the sustainability agenda, and they want to get to the point where there's free cooling, there's all the things that drive efficiency and drive these data centers to be much more green. I think the biggest issue is, what do we do with diesel generation? And I think that's got the biggest focus, because you appreciate we have to keep the power on 24/7. And in order to do that, we have to provide resilience in case the grids go down. which means that right now the only way that we can provide significant amounts of power during grid failures is through diesel standby generation. And bearing in mind, there's a lot of grids that are extremely stable, and the only time the generators get used is when we're testing them once a month. It just seems perverse for the planet that we have these engines that sit there and the diesel tanks sit there full, and we just run them to test them. And I think Brussels' big focus, and certainly Westminster's focus, is going to be on, okay, so how can we migrate to a scenario where you don't need those engines? But that's not near term. That's something we're working on, and we'll be working on for a long time.
Okay. And given it's your corporate customers who are using the colo facilities that are driving that sustainability agenda, are you seeing any other changes in data centers in terms of things that are sort of high on the corporate agenda at the moment, maybe like diversity or?
Absolutely, and it's a privilege to talk to Cornet, of course, but also it's good to work with you guys, because you're really trying to grapple with the same issues. We're part of the real estate sector, and one of the big issues around diversity that we're finding is it's all about the applicant pool, because real estate has traditionally been not a very diverse sector. What we're trying to do is change the applicant pool so that we've got a much better chance of meeting our diversity goals with the absolutely the right candidates, because we've got a decent choice. And I think, therefore, we're trying to take learnings from other industries. Dare I say it, the pandemic helps in that what we're looking to do is repurpose people from other industries that might have a more diverse applicant base or employee base. But sustainability diversity is right up there, in the sense that the industry scores really pretty poorly, and we've got to do something to change that, and got to do something to change that very rapidly. And it's becoming very important in terms of when we're bidding to customers, not just the sustainability agenda, but now the diversity agenda is coming through, in that they will only work with you if you've got a clear statement and a clear policy and a clear plan to meet your goals. And when you've only got a handful of very, very large customers, if you effectively alienate yourself because of your inability to grapple with sustainability and diversity, then that you're gonna lose market share, and you're gonna do serious damage to your business. So we've got to figure it out.
What else is CyrusOne doing to reposition for the future right now? It sounds like there's a real boom time in what has been, I guess, quite a steady industry for a good number of years, probably as long as I have been in real estate. And now all of a sudden it's exploded. Can that continue? Will it continue? And how do you plan for that?
Yeah, I guess I've got to put it in context, Vanessa. So, it's actually been quite a frustrating industry since, if you take the view, this industry's genesis was in the late 90s with effectively the telco boom. So when the large US telcos decided to start deploying networks globally, they came to Europe, went to Asia, and if you like, the co-location market was born because big facilities were put on top of telecom infrastructure interconnect points. So, that, if you think back to that industry, it grew really quickly, and then it absolutely tanked in 2000, 2001. And the surplus capacity that was fueled largely by sort of private equity taking a far too optimistic view on demand, the surplus capacity managed to be repositioned, but over quite a long time, by virtue of a very unfortunate event, 9/11, which led to a lot of authorities, particularly as it related to the banking sector, insisting that companies diversified their data center portfolios and outsourced elements of their platforms. So it was stuttering. It grew then during the enterprise phase, and then with this latest phase, which is the hyperscale phase, is driven by enterprise outsourcing to the cloud. And there's a lot of facilities that need to be repositioned to be appropriate, as we've talked about, for that. So it's not been an easy ride, and also there's been a fundamental lack of understanding, particularly from the real estate industry, about data centers, because it was never big enough really to get on anybody's agenda. So when I have discussions particularly with investors who want to come into the sector, they're almost the same discussions I was having 20 years ago, in terms of lack of fundamental understanding about what a data center is, how the contracts that underpin our relationship with our customers work, etc. So a big piece of where we go, to your question about how we repositioning, is about continued knowledge sharing to ensure the broader real estate industry really gets data centers. It's helped at the moment by a wall of capital that's looking at data centers, because it's obviously pivoted from focus on industries that have suffered during the pandemic and are going to take a while to recover. So it's all about getting them to understand, but then we really do need to take the status that's developed during the pandemic, whether it be essential in the eyes of certain governments or critical in the eyes of other governments, and take the opportunity to lobby to ensure that we can get things done in a more expedient manner, that we can get permits quicker, that we can lobby to ensure that grid reinforcement on power happens quicker, etc. Because as an industry, it's not that complicated. We can find the land, we can build the facilities, we can deliver capacity to our customers. It's just the red tape that gets in the way of being able to do that as quickly as the demand curve would demand that we deliver.
Okay. So I'm seeing some interesting questions come through on the chat as well here, Matt. Lisa has asked us about the pact between the organisations that you mentioned earlier, and she'd say, can you share the name of that agreement or that pact?
It's called the Carbon. It's called the Carbon Neutral Pact. The people who really push the agenda with the EU DCA, which is basically the European Data Center Association, chaired by Michael Winterton from Equinix. So, frankly, if you Google EU DCA Carbon Neutral Pact Michael Winterton, you'll find it. There was quite a lot of press via the Kickstart, which was the Dutch Data Center Association's conference that really kicked off this calendar year, and that's where the main announcement was made. But you'll find it.
Okay, and Freya said that it's great to hear that CyrusOne has some amazing targets with net zero carbon and diversity goals, which is great. So
just going to read them now.
And when we were talking earlier, just going back to a conversation that we had about that enterprise market, are there any sort of key players who are working together to drive that or to enhance that at the moment, or you're not really allowed to tell?
I'm not sure. I'm grasping the question properly. So just ask me again.
Sorry. So when we were talking earlier before we went live, there was some comments around kind of the big players, should we say, in various sectors. I don't want to mention any names in case you're not allowed to say, but we talked about a couple of really big organizations who are driving some of that change. Are they working together on that, or is that just their individual?
Absolutely. I mean, the biggest players in the cloud market, it's public information. They're Amazon, they're Microsoft, they're Google, and they're dominating the demand in the data center market in Europe, and hence why I reference the fact that those companies, with the power that they have, but also the visibility that they have, are helping us in a lot of ways, particularly around sustainability, etc. Because as corporations, they're setting enormous targets because they want to preserve their reputation. And I think it comes back to something, Vanessa, we've talked offline around, which is that there is a concern that as an industry, we're being benefited by the pandemic. So kind of what are we giving back as a result of that? And I think if you were to talk to any of those big organisations, they would say that that's an issue that they have always front of mind, that they've always got to be demonstrating that whilst their market cap is growing, and some of these organisations have got market cap bigger than the FTSE 100 or bigger than all of the indexes in Europe put together, and therefore there's an awful lot of pressure on them to demonstrate that they're being socially responsible, etc., etc. So yeah, we're all working together.
Okay, and also when we were talking earlier, we were talking about how a lot of people are now working from home, and this is something that obviously CoreNet has been discussing quite a lot. And you said that it hadn't necessarily been all good in terms of people and working from home and the standards.
We talked. It's quite a controversial point, really, isn't it? I think it's easier to be tough. It's easier to say no. It's easier to sometimes skirt the margins of professionalism when nobody can see you. They can only hear you, and you can hide behind technology, which sounds a bit tough. But I think there's probably equally a degree of sensitivity that people are out on the front line every day, putting themselves at risk, putting their families at risk, etc., who've become extremely fatigued, are just craving a bit of human understanding, craving preserving professionalism, craving preserving humanity. To be honest, I'm not saying that there's any major issues out there at all, not at all. I'm just making a statement that we all need to remember to respect each other as humans, and sometimes that's not as easy when you're doing it through technology and remotely as it is when you're together. It's as simple as that.
And so for the CyrusOne teams who are more office-based than out on the sites, is working from home going to be a thing moving forward when we get back to normal, if we're calling it that, or are you going to be doing flex?
It's a thing, and on one point, I guess, Vanessa, I didn't mention that I need to mention is that what we're very conscious about is that it's not just the people out on site putting themselves in harm's way who need to get all the focus and attention. At the end of the day, our headquarters staff, are having challenges themselves, and if they're in small accommodation with their families and they're finding it hard to get the space that they need to work effectively, everyone's got issues during the pandemic, and all of those issues have to be respected. And it was a big thing for us because the natural inclination at the beginning was to effectively just throw our love and attention at our operations and construction staff, giving them all a pizza on a Friday, or sending them a survival pack with a happy coffee mug and t-shirts, But we soon stopped, and not stopped doing that, but paused to say, well, we also need to understand the issues that everybody's going through and treat everybody the same. So, you know, we've made big efforts to be inclusive around not just our frontline folk, but also our office staff. Because, you know, at the end of the day, if our finance team weren't performing, then the whole business would start to crumble. So yeah, I think it's important that you recognise everyone's contribution during the pandemic. But will working from home be a thing? I think it's going to be a thing for everybody. You know, we're fortunate in Europe. It's a bit different in the US because of the scale of the operation. You know, our office, you know, we can use the stairs to get to the office. We're not on the 20th floor of a tower block, and you know, we don't have a very dense environment, and we don't have that many people in the office, so we can carry on implementing social distancing measures, making people feel really quite safe and comfortable to come back to work. We're obviously not in a position to really predict when we'd like people back in the office, if they're comfortable to come back to the office, because we just don't know, do we? I mean, if we see all social distancing measures being put aside in June, great, but then we hit the summer, and the last thing we want to do is really when you know, families particularly have a chance to go out and enjoy themselves. We don't want to be suddenly putting really heavy pressure on people to come back to the office, have a less efficient day, spend less time with their family, just because we have some archaic view that everyone should be in the office. So, you know, I think we're going to be measured, particularly when social distancing goes away over the summer. I think we need to be considerate, and we need to think about when it's right. Our customers also, that's another good thing about working with the world's biggest corporations, is that, you know, they often do set the benchmark, they set the agenda. A lot of them are talking about not going back to standard office work till next year. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's still a situation where people are trying to figure out what the right thing is, or the right way forward is, and it's kind of brought up some quite controversial ideas. And I was on a call the other day, and someone was saying, well, is it possible to kind of insist that our people have the vaccine before they come back? Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? I mean, is that something that you could would ever do?
I mean, I can't really speak for the company, but, you know, I think that's a really dangerous area. You know, you can't. It's a really dangerous area. You from a personal point of view now, you know, it's very difficult to insist that somebody, you know, takes a vaccine. Then it becomes very difficult to even start to say, well, you know, unless you can't come back to the office. Yeah, it's a minefield, that area. Thanks for asking that question.
I like a controversial question. Okay, excellent. So just as I'm conscious of time and we're coming towards the end of our slot, in terms of repositioning for growth, which is our theme for the quarter, is there anything else in the data center world that we ought to dig into? Well,
I think the enormous point that I want to get out to the people listening and to CoreNet generally is, you know, please take a look at data centers, peer over the fence. Career opportunities obviously abound because of the growth, and particularly our focus needs to be on repositioning people who've not been so fortunate during the pandemic because of the industries they work in. I really encourage as well, from you hear what I'm saying about we'd love a more diverse applicant pool. When you think about, you know, what we do, real estate's at the heart of it, but also there's a lot of sort of engineering involved. And what I'd dearly love to see is a more diverse group coming through the engineering routes. We're obviously going out there and we're sponsoring technical colleges who might be in line with the aviation industry to try and reposition people into data centers. We're going out to the universities because what we want to do is try and encourage folk who wouldn't traditionally think that data centers would be attractive to them, but actually, it's the future, as most things associated with the digital economy are. And at the moment, it's a fairly consistent pool of talent that circles around and within the data center industry. And I'd just love to see that pool of talent just explode and become bigger, become more diverse. But it's got to start with knowledge and understanding. And I just it drives me mad when people are scared off by perceived complexity of our industry because of the acronyms and the buzzwords and everything else. It's not complicated at all. And if you've got any aptitude in real estate or engineering, you should have a look at the industry. Sorry, that's my that's my
your sales pitch. Okay, and we've also had a question come through from Vernon, which links back to your previous point on the future location of data centers, and will it be dictated by the availability of green power infrastructure more than anything else?
The answer is it can't be. This is the point about data centers have to follow GDP, have to be in urban and suburban locations. Where a data center goes down to serve a market, it has to be in a dense fiber environment. It has to have power availability. There has to be land availability, and we could go into all the complexities, but at the end of the day, it's all about latency for the compute side of the business. So, the most extreme example of that is that if a data center for a financial services trading platform is very close to the trader, there's going to be a competitive advantage because of latency on trade. Now, you can just expand that thinking quite easily and say, well, okay, same applies if your son or your daughter's on their Xbox, they want a low latency experience. They really want to enjoy the experience. And so it just means that because light only travels at the speed of light and they can't travel any faster, that, data centers, in many cases, for many platforms, need to be, close to the action. Now, for storage, it's a different story. And for experiences that don't need low latency or ultra low latency, it's okay. That's why you see Facebook being effectively in Dublin and being in the Nordics, and only having a very small presence in each major market, because they don't need to provide ultra or low latency to the degree that others do. But I think this is, Vernon's question is really interesting, because what it does show is that there's this absolute need for us to figure out how we can provide green energy in those urban and suburban environments. It's fine. By the end of this year in Europe, we'll be procuring 100% green energy. Fine, but that's through all the methods that everybody knows about. But the true test will be, as technology develops, can we move away from diesel generation? Can we start to rely on hydrogen? Could you ever foresee a hydrogen grid being developed? So this is why we need to work hand in glove with the governments, because we can't, as an industry, we can't solve for those national infrastructure issues or regional infrastructure issues. We need help.
Okay, lovely. Well, we are now coming to the end of our slot. So I guess it remains for me to say thank you ever so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, you sharing your time and your insights with us. And that's it. Another thank you to our fantastic sponsors and to Matt of CyrusOne.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks.